Hello everyone, today we talk about the traditional virility of the patriciate in the Indo-European and not only culture and not only. We will surely dedicate multiple videos to this. I'm planning to get a bit more in depth to the whole religious historical side of the story, and especially this one that I notice you tend to follow with some greater enthusiasm. Well, not really more than much, like still better than the Christian history videos that are actually very important, and they are usually, in fact, very much tied also to my sort of medieval historical background. So those are always important because they actually align with this other content pretty much. But this is still a different perspective that is usually not expressed when even looking at the continuity of these Catholic ideals in the Christian era, and so up to this day, because they are truly universal and truly traditional. Now, let's start from the Indo-Aryans, from the Vedic tradition, that exemplifies essentially one of the most thorough embodiments of such principles. We never talked about the virility of the patriciate so far, but as you understand, it aligns with a broader notion of Apollonian power that is hierarchically the upper force managing to cram, essentially order, form into the substance, into the chthonic, the feminine, and managing to transcend the wall through, in fact, the enactment of such organism, of such body, literally. We could have approached this topic from a more straightforward direction, but it's already interesting the way it is, and it especially pairs well with the videos that we already made about sacred royalty, that is, of course, all one with it. Then we will expand, of course, from these topics over many others that unavoidably overlap. But if you are a medium sort of old Schwerpunkt follower, you know more or less what we're talking about. Now, within the aforementioned Indo-Aryan system, the Brahmana caste, also known as Brahman, did not occupy the pinnacle of the social order because of physical might or material wealth, nor due to a structure akin to a church. This doesn't mean, by the way, that these people did not really wield actual power. People tend to gnostically separate the notion of power with one of wealth, and or of power earthly intended from a more, divine force that would be of a different nature. It's actually the reflection of one another at the same time. But as we know also from the Christian message, what may appear, right, in a certain way doesn't necessarily correspond to actually wielded power. You can essentially manage to transfigure the world without necessarily owning much. And the reasons why this, without digressing on evangelical considerations, this may have a specific meaning for you, meaning that what happens is not just always straightforwardly say, reflective in a direct proportional sense to that level of power. It may be specifically a masked power that is testing you. This is to be found throughout all these traditions. Think about the pilgrim, like in the Germanic world, it could be still Woden under different spoils that is testing you there. So not everything is what it seems, really, but this is not much a problem of the essential nature of power for how it is theologically understood. Rather, a reflecting, like, our own limits, our own shortcomings. You can see very powerful figures and, of course, admiring that level of imperium, but there is also an imperium that acts behind the scenes in a less straightforwardly earthly fashion that is worth appreciating. Now, regarding the Brahmana case, a bit of background here, because it's always interesting, of course, and it sort of stiffens the content a bit. Also referred to as Brahman. This was the highest ranking social group, right, in the traditional Indo-Aryan caste system, particularly within the ancient society as shaped by Vedic tradition. This case, I made videos about the Vedic tradition in general. We explained how, say, historical or even prehistorical thing sort of unfolded in terms of the legacy of this heritage and how this reflects also up to today in the Indo-European in local traditions, regardless, in fact, of the heavy, mostly the generation, as always, throughout the millennia. Consider we don't even have an actual archaeological record of the Vedas per se. We know they were there, they were so powerful because of the literary tradition, but it belongs to such an ancient time that is ancient not just in a historical sense, but truly in a spiritual one that we'll have to come back on. We already talked about the steppes, we already talked about the ancient Iranian peoples, but we will get more into the primal energy of that, ancestry. Now, this case was primarily associated with, of course, the spiritual, priestly, and intellectual functions, rather than, in that sense, what we conventionally understand as material power or wealth in an earthly dimension. Unlike hierarchies based on physical strength, economic resources, or institutional structures like the church even, during the Middle Ages, we talk about warrior bishops, for example, the Brahmana's elevated status stemmed exclusively within this context from its unique privilege, the performance of sacrificial rites that we understand better now. And so these rituals were considered essential for maintaining the cosmic order and connecting the human realm with divine forces. We've seen this also in the Roman world, as far as that case as in a more, directly militarized system where, in fact, the priesthood was subordinated to that warlike virility, more direct warrior participation. Actually, the reason why this was going on is that what we understand from the Indian tradition is that initial superiority of the warrior class at some point was surpassed by the priesthood. And this is an issue, at least if this separation occurs to begin with, because as we just exemplified, Roman magistrates, for example, weren't something like that, nor like the earlier power figures, right, in the archaic era. So this is something that we will comparatively leave for another time. But it's important here to appreciate, in fact, the nature of the priesthood itself en passant, because of the, in fact, essentially just inward power. That if you look at, the Gregorian reforms, the role of the papacy in the West, just know that basically this is a similar stage in development. That tells you also, by the way, how much more traditionally archaic Europeans were, even with a much more advanced society by that point in history, also compared to the ones the Vedas had once existed. And so you want to appreciate the depth of this dimension. Now, in any case, the role of the Brahmana is crucial, because it's not merely about the ritual practice that we described in recent videos about history of religions, where we have seen how it's essentially the spirit of the rite performer, rather than the material performance of the rite itself, that vehiculates divine power into the world, right? And so the Brahmana here match perfectly and almost par excellence in the Vedic context, the pure sort of the embodiment of a profound spiritual quality derived from the capacity of enacting these rites themselves, like through the act of sacrifice, which we will also describe better at some point. The Brahmana were infused with an energy, right? Some would call it psychic, because the notion is that in the brewing, in the boiling waters of the psyche, there is a universal, a cosmic resonance with, in fact, the universe, the celestial bodies, from which that actual power, the imperium itself, derives. we will talk a bit more surely about the single most primitive knowledge we have, also just through language, for example, through the linguistical roots of this, or they're some of the most powerful of the Indo-European world. But this energy is what we understand as the Holy Ghost, right? And described, in fact, as both fearsome and beneficial, because this is just divine power, and so it can be grace or wrath, that aligned the Brahmana with the nature of the supernatural powers they invoke themselves. So this quality distinguished them from other cases, rendering them superior, venerated, and feared within society, even surpassing the leaders. Like if you look at the issue of Buddhism, it's effectively a protest, like in the Christian sense, towards the traditional imperium holders that had somehow failed in preserving the standard, so asked for a more spiritual renewal. In the case of Buddha, by the way, we're looking at a military and an aristocratic background, so it's even more relevant in a sense, and it's fascinating that the West instead had in Christ a figure that, in that sense, was questioning not much the military side of the story, per se, but the spiritual fundamentals. We also made lots of videos showing how early Christians were perfectly fine with the Roman conquests, with the Roman army, to which they participated in large numbers without any problem about bloodshed per se. It was not also the cause of the various military martyrs that were all pretty darn good soldiers and killers. As a matter of fact, most people literally ignore this. They do not understand what the universality of this, in fact, of these Catholic meanings really entails, right? It's not an act of simple, well, okay, we can do whatever you want. It's about everyone, and so let's include it. No, it has nothing to do with that. It has the purifying fire, really more just like in the traditional sense of what needs to be done, even just to avenge sin. That is enacted in these systems. Now, speaking of the Brahman again, it was their faculty was not a temporary attribute, but a lifelong essence that also passed down hereditarily, becoming a transcendent inheritance embedded in their bloodline, as we will see now. And this racial property was periodically reawakened and made effective in individuals throughout initiation rites, ensuring cases continuity and sanctity across the generation. This racial property was periodically reawakened and made effective in individuals through initiation rites, ensuring the case's continuity and sanctity across the generations. This concept is to be found, as we've seen also in the West, among the sacrality attached to the cingulum militaris, for example, and so that veritable, psychophysical molding that stemmed from the exercise of arms that, as we just said, was also considered at some point, say, too earthly, a business. Think about how, in that sense, again, in the tripartite medieval society, ideally, like that priestly lifestyle was considered, pure, also because it did not fundamentally go out there in the world, but was specialized in a spiritual cultivation. Bloodshed was considered a sin, and we should talk about, say, as I was just saying also about the Christians in the Roman army, actually not that prohibitive in an absolute sense. Nobody really at that point was saying you shouldn't spill blood, like for a higher cause, right? But this was still considered, as we've seen in a couple of videos I made on the early medieval sacramentaries and penitentials, a necessary evil to achieve a greater, a higher being, right? And the true, of course, the self-sacrifice that passed through the killing of an enemy, through at least it was used as almost as an auxilium to be in the condition of attaining that carelessness, or at least towards the self as a transient being, and looking at the higher one in the perennial superior nature that you could rise to once you properly deposed that fear. This was true also in fact, martyrology, as we were saying before, and it overlapped with, say, military saints, we pointed out before. Excuse me, drink a little. So, symbolically, the Brahmana were often likened to the sun, or embodying an energy or radiant splendor known as tejas. This radiance described as being drawn, quote, like a flame, from their vital force through, quote, spiritual knowledge, underscored their divine connection, as expressed by the Shatapatha-brahmana 13 to 610 and the Patriciate 2:4. We will talk about this in a while, just to explain, of course, what these texts are and why they're cited here. Well, the Brahmana role was thus not just performative, but, as we've seen, deeply metaphysical, positioning them as mediators between the human and the divine. The dignity and authority of the Brahmana caste were thus measured by the difficulty and utility of their exclusive functions. Above all, their ability to activate spiritual influences through ritual, which was seen as the most valuable and challenging task in the world of tradition. Again, regardless of the separation between, let's say, the priestly dimension and the warrior one. Again, in India, this had happened because it was such a big system that castes sort of, say, it was a quicker degeneration, and castes separated earlier. But they also sclerotized to a degree, and the top sort of lost, the warrior element lost that leadership, and the priests took over. This is explained also, by the way, in the Manavadharma Shastra 9, 314, 317 that we will see later. Right? So this aspect is fascinating because, unlike other cases, by the way, the Brahmana did not rely on a centralized organization or physical dominance to assert their position. This contrasted with the secular authorities that existed in India as well, and scattered as individual bearers of an immaterial unity, not limited, of course, to mere humanity, they wielded an unparalleled prestige in ancient India. This reverence, rooted in their sacred role rather than coercion, surpassed the influence of even the most powerful tyrants, highlighting the profound cultural and spiritual significance of the Brahmana caste in the Indo-Aryan framework. Right. So the aforementioned text, in particular the Shatapatha-brahmana, that is one of the most extensive and important texts within the Brahmanas, a category in terms of Vedic literature that provides explanations, interpretations, and instructions for the rituals outlined in the earlier Samhitas or hymns of the Vedas. Specifically, it is attached to the Shukla Yajurveda, so the White Yajurveda, one of the four Vedas, and is renowned for its detailed commentary on sacrificial rites. The title Shatapatha translates roughly to having 100 paths, interesting enough, because Shata means 100, and Patha literally means path. By the way, and there are other actual interesting etymological connections there, even with the same father, etc. Now, speaking of virility, of course, of this all. And this reflects, of course, the comprehensive scope, though it exceeds a literal 100 sections even. And again, we're not talking here the literary and sort of philological vicissitudes of the Vedic text, because we're going to hang ourselves. Now, an important aspect here, why we cited those passages before. 13 to 610 refers to the organizational structure, that is the book known as Kanda in the original language. 13 is the number. Chapter Adhyaya is 2, section Brahmana 6, verse or subsection 10. So the Shatapatha-brahmana is divided into 14 books, and book 13 likely deals with the advanced ritualistic or cosmological themes, such as the Agni Kayana, right? The building of the fire altar, agna, ignis in Latin, etc. As you know, the Vedic is particularly akin to Latin, considering the distance. So other elaborate sacrifices. In the context of the Brahmana case, this specific passage is cited to illustrate the concept of tejas, we mentioned before, so the radiant spiritual energy that the Brahmana draws from his vital force through spiritual knowledge. What is important is that this force is not simply mediated from God. It is, in a metaphysical sense, of course, between the two natures, like the perennial one and this one of humans, essentially, that, yes, have essentially a greater divine dimension, but that at the end of the day are perpetually rising as the kings of the living in this in-between space between, in fact, the two natures, right? And so heaven and earth. And this monastic metaphor, of course, likens the force itself coming from the within in this world. So they literally emanate, they're not simple vessels of divine force, to a flame, right? And so this text underscores the metaphysical underpinnings of the Brahmana's role as a ritual efficient in their solar symbolism, connecting their authority to divine power. Let's pass briefly to the Far Eastern traditions, because these are incredibly important as well. Here, the ideal of a true leader that we have already seen, especially probably in the Chinese tradition, I made an entire video about this, the Wei Wu Wei and more, is often linked to someone for whom nothing is more evident than the things hidden in the secret of consciousness. Nothing is more manifest than the subtlest causes of actions. It's a very beautiful way of saying this derives from the Zongyang that we'll see we have already encountered. And that also says that also to those vast and profound powers of heaven and earth that, quote, have, however subtle and imperceptible, manifest themselves in the bodily forms of beings, right? So it gives you really a complete layering of the depths of reality, and what also transcends this reality itself. There is a coming into being that is clear to the sage, to the leader, to the wise, that, remember, are incredibly Indo-European terms. Remember what providence means, what vision is intended for, literally here, and wisdom, literally stemming from that same etymology. So it's something you can appreciate when in life you yourself reach a point whereby you are sort of aware of the complexity of reality, where you don't try essentially just to be passive to it and or to hope that, you know, your tiny action is going to shift just the balance from a direction to another of something that of a bigger system that, after all, you have no clue about, as it seems like social media tends today to manifest, to attract especially the lower masses. This is particularly interesting because it's instead clear that the greater complexity of reality makes you, and that's also something you have to acquire, nothing is really to given for granted, impatient in front of what for you seems so clear and to the others is not, right? That makes you aware also what other people feel like, reason like. From a few words you can understand so much and more. So this was understood as a vision that went beyond mere say basic understanding. Now the Zongyang we've already added is often transliterated also as something like Chung Yung in English phonetics, or doctrine of the mean. Hence again the medium in the ritual is a foundational text. As you know, in Chinese philosophy, particularly within Confucianism, it's one of the 4 books, the Sishu, a collection of Confucian classics compiled and annotated by the philosopher Xu Zhu during the Song dynasty in the 12th century. We also made a video about those, which became central to Confucian education and the imperial examination system in China, alongside the analogues Lu, Mencius, Mengzi, and the great learning, the Daxue, the Zongyang holds a prominent place in articulating Confucian ethical, metaphysical, and political ideals. Originally, the Zongyang is a chapter extracted from the Li Ji, that is, the Book of Rites, one of the 5 classics, the Wu Jing of ancient Chinese literature, a broader corpus traditionally attributed to Confucius or his disciples. Its authorship is traditionally ascribed to Zisi, that is Kongji, or essentially Confucius' grandson, though modern scholarship debates the precise origin, suggesting it may have been composed or compiled by multiple hands over time, likely between the 5th and the 3rd centuries BC, during the Warring States period of China. The title Zongyang translates to the doctrine of the mean, or centrality and harmony, reflecting its core theme, the pursuit of balance, moderation, and alignment with the natural and moral order of the universe. And the text explores the concept of Zong, centrality or equilibrium, and Yang, hence the title, like that is the latter is harmony or universal application, emphasizing how a virtuous individual, particularly a leader, achieves inner balance and outer harmony by aligning with Tao, that is the way, and the principles of Tian, that is heaven. So you understand here that there is essentially a uniformation to the perennial order. In the way this is effectively achieved in the lower nature through this mean that is all revolving around rituals, and again is a prerogative of leaders to begin with. It integrates ethical behavior, self-cultivation, and cosmic order, presenting the ideal man as one who embodies sincerity, Cheng. This was incredibly important in also the Indo-Aryan tradition. You couldn't really be bestowed by God the winged glory by saying even just one lie, right? Think about, especially certain regimes in current time. I will not make any names, but obviously wisdom, so this providential capacity, and so to make things happen, you're according to that heavenly path, and moral clarity. I mean, without ambiguity, like being self-evidently explicative and satisfactory in embodying such virtues in front of the world, because this is what also, as we know from the monastic tradition, the entire purpose was. Also, when there was just a merely spiritual cultivation, this wasn't to be an end to itself. It had to, in fact, save the world and so all the people within it. So this resonates with the archetype of the true leader reference in basically the context we are discussing here, where the Zongyang illustrates a figure for whom, quote, nothing is more evident than the things hidden in the secret of consciousness. The aforementioned passages, namely chapter 1, section 3, underscores the rarity and value of achieving the mean or balanced state, suggesting that only the sage or superior person, the Yunzi, fully realizes this harmony, which connects the human mind to the unseen workings of the cosmos. It ties into the idea of a leader's intuitive grasp of hidden truths. The chapter 16, 1.5, elaborates on the subtle yet pervasive influence of heaven and earth. Right, this is very important at the ends of the doctrine of the two natures, because it shows you how they're not hypostatically separated, but how they constantly intertwine with one another. Always never make the Gnostic mistake of thinking we're talking about, spirit and matter. This is not, those are never separated. It's just a physis, and one is in its full plenitude and is unchangeable, and the other is basically just a degeneration, but it has the potential to return to that former one. And it manifests to these leaders that have exactly that specific mission. And in fact, this pervasive influence of both nature, though apparently imperceptible, actually does shape all of existence. It reflects a metaphysical view where the leader's ritual and moral actions align with these cosmic forces, a concept paralleling the Brahmana's role in Vedic rites. So there are also different, let's say, there is a level on which the rite functions that is evidently separated from most experiences, but commending them at the same time. Nothing seemed more challenging than forging a genuine active connection with the unseen forces, which could easily overpower the reckless who approach them without proper understanding or requisite qualifications. It was precisely for this reason, existing as a dispersed, purely immaterial collective of individuals, not limited to the human, that the Brahmana caste managed to command respect and prestige among India's masses from ancient times. It's an illusion because, as we explained, there isn't much a matter of material divide here. Like these priests were able, of course, to command an enormous amount of matter if you just focus on that, as much as the people are still included. But it stemmed mostly from this, in fact, type of power. There's not merely cumulative, it doesn't stem from some sort of recognized convention, but that is also reflective of power and helps plane it, but it's not the original source of, right? And so remember that matter in the higher nature is basically there. It's just transfigured to a degree that you cannot say it's the difference between spirit and matter, because in practice it's all one into it. It's the most perfect being. This reverence, just because we're coming back to the temporally to the Indo-Aryans, was unmatched by even the most heavily armed tyrant, apparently. Think about how this actually corresponded to what you see in the investiture controversy in the Middle Ages, and how imperial power was limited exactly because it had failed, in part, to properly rise to that compenetrative and hierarchically dominant organic system, like in which the church would have been inclusively supported. For the basis of this Brahmana's authority, the most important text is the aforementioned Manava Dharma Shastra, and in particular 9, 314, 317. So the Manava Dharma Shastra, commonly translated as Manus Murti or Manus Miriti, also known as the Laws of Manu, is one of the most significant and authoritative texts in ancient Indian legal and social tradition, belonging to the genre of Dharma Shastras, that is, texts that outline the principles of the Dharma, that, as you know, is the duty, the law, the righteousness, and cosmic order. So this is unsurprisingly foundational in metaphysical sense. Composed in Sanskrit, it is traditionally attributed to Manu, the mythical progenitor of humanity in Hindu cosmology, though its actual authorship is likely a compilation by multiple Brahmanical scholars over time. Of course, Sanskrit, as we were saying before, with Latin, with, English, etc., like, it has this radical similarities stemming from the Indo-European background. Scholars date the composition of the Manava Dharma Shastra to roughly between 200 BC and 280, with possible later interpolations placed in the late Vedic or early classical period of Indian history. And again, this tells you, by the way, how strong these principles had historically been in order to be put into writing just millennia after the originary principle was affirmed. And so how strong properly the sacredness and the commitment in the perpetuation of the same formulas of the passage of the same knowledge really was in ancient India. The Manavadharma Shastra serves as a comprehensive guide, after all, to social, moral, legal, and religious conduct, particularly within the framework of the Varna, so that the caste system, and ashramas, the stages of life. It codifies the duties, privileges, and responsibilities of each caste. So the Brahmana, so the priests/scholars as well, the Kshatriya, that are of course like the warriors and rulers, the Vaishya, and merchants and farmers, and Shudra, the servants. So they are the traditional three, the Indo-European tripartite order, plus the slaves that are, of course, not part of the people as such. They are not even people, technically. While also addressing broader societal norms such as marriage, inheritance, and punishment. The influence of this text extends beyond religious doctrine, shaping Hindu law and ethics for centuries, notably informing later legal codes until British colonial rule in India. And the passage that we cited, the one from the book 9, verses 314-317, essentially addresses the foundational basis of the Brahmana's authority. It emphasizes the Brahmana's supremacy in the social hierarchy, not due to wealth or force, but because of their sacred knowledge, ritual expertise, and divine connections. Specifically, these passages affirm that the Brahmana's role in performing Vedic rites and upholding Dharma grants them a unique prestige, commanding respect and obedience from other castes. For instance, the verse 317 famously states that even a Brahman of minimal learning surpasses others in status due to his birth and sacred function, reinforcing their inherited spiritual privilege. This, again, is all mixed with genetic connection. This is interestingly not present in the West, for example, for the later priestly caste. There are some connections. At least there are some priests that, of course, are chosen because, in theory, like this is true also for the church. They are chosen because of some virtue that is manifest, right? And that cannot obviously be disjuncted from a genetic background. But you understand how, in this case, the Brahmana have acquired such an enormous power just as a case. This actually speaks of the relative sclerotization of the system. And so it's mostly, it still reinforces, of course, the importance of the Vedas' impact on these cultures, but at the same time, it also shows you the limit of a system that is simply based on this concept. So going back to other countries like China, Hellas, and Rome, the patriciate, where the patriciate really rules, by the way, the patriciate was fundamentally characterized here by its possession and practice of rites at the same time, right? So connected to the divine potency of the founding ancestor, rites unavailable to the plebeians. This is interesting because, and I already explained this in the Indo and video about the Vedas, that regardless of the fact that the Vedas were a bit like the single most hardcore Indo-European people through the way, we through the legacy that they left. Again, this millenary legacy that could live so long just solely by oral tradition and this fundamental molding of Indian culture, even after the Vedas had relatively gone. Of course, they had remained within the system, and of course, like the religion had been preserved and all, together with the case, this hierarchy and so on. But you can argue that the southernmost Indo-European achievement, this enormous, in fact, subcontinent that is, as you know, incredibly devouring in many ways. It's very much embodying the principle of the maternal chthonic, all devouring force that challenges sacred virility, on which, in fact, the Indo-European rule over India was based, is really indicative of a more, say, pronounced process of degeneration. In part, India is also sheltered, right? This happens also in other historical phases. The Mongols, for example, do not manage later on to take India, but just make an example, this really remains a thing on its own to this day. Whereas China, Hellas, Rome, etc. had paradoxically some greater connection to the openness of the Indo-European, say, of the steppes waves that at the end of the day, especially during Indo-European times, were reminding what this system had always been about. And of course, like the same Indo-European conquest of Europe is relatively recent, but we are at the same Vedas times in India. There are also further waves, of course. The same can be said for China. Because China, of course, is not an Indo-European country, but it's been rightfully hypothesized that as far as the original principles of the rule, even though diluted in an even bigger basin of fairly advanced civilization at some point, would have come from the Indo-European steppes. The original elites, if you look at the spread, for example, the war chariot in general, like it follows a pattern that is normally consistent with the Indo-European migrations. And China did have this in, say, modest form. We were not, again, nobody tells us really what these first rulers really were in China, but it wouldn't be really strange to think they were Indo-Europeans themselves. And exactly because of this greater Eurasian openness, that essentially from which the Indian subcontinent can be seen as separated, and especially thanks to the junction between Eastern and Western Eurasia in the steppes corridors, the primal sense that, as we've seen, those who ruled on earth were also the actual, not just the priests, right? Just like the Pontifex Maximus in Rome, say, but in fact those who commanded the armies and more. And so they were an all-round heroic establishment continued, right? And Europe actually has a much stronger sense of this. China, if anything, from a social point of view, sclerotizes a bit more. Europe is gravid with warlike peoples during all antiquity, right? And definitely Hellas and Rome embodying essentially the most successful of the Indo-European branches that had historically, in fact, seized the best parts of the continent and bring into things like Alexander, the Roman Empire, as a consequence. All things that I discussed in the videos about the cycles of the rise and fall of the Hellenic and the Roman civilization never really died, so they didn't make it in that sense, but it was part of the cyclical sense. And of course, you can argue not even the Hellenic or whatever here, not even the Vedic or the old Chinese one really died, but yes, by degrees, something else happened, including Rome taking over Greece, for example, and at that point, Romanity being taken over by the Germans in the migration era, but bringing to the Romanization of the Germans, even in an ethnically metaphysical sense, with the Ottonians, the Novatio Imperi. Those are all topics, in fact, we'll have to discuss once again. There is also this understanding of the distinction between the patriciate and the people, the common people, the humans actually. So the difference between mankind and humanity that is actually radical and particularly important. Human literally means dirty in Latin. That's what human means. Sorry to remind, there is mankind, that as we've seen is a much better definition given the same Indo-European etymology and origin of the term. Now, in China, only patricians engaged in the rites known as yili, while the plebeians were left with mere customs, the su. This actually paralleled the way to the afterlife that we documented in other videos, where we've seen how essentially the soul, the most important soul, the second one, right? Not the, let's say, the one of the exterior of the person, of the persona, meant in Latin, that dies in the moment of what we call death, and then not the chthonic somatic principle that comes back. This is the third soul that comes back to the underworld and is remolded within the totem of the ancestors. But the second soul, right, the proper spirit that embodies in the command of the whole being, that is judged, right? He has to win a second death, right? If it fails, this will essentially dissipate eventually. If succeeding instead, this will earn essentially in a heroic fashion a place in the firmament, and will essentially be in the ranks of the angels for the great end time battle, and keeping to contribute to the earthly dimension, literally intervening in it actively wise, rather than simply roaming the land as a ghost in case not passing the judgment at the moment beyond the first death. This is relevant, yes, because there is eventually an ultimate judgment beyond, and these souls that remain on earth and that do not dissolve, basically they are to be, and even we can never really say that they fully dissolve, but there is this possibility and hope, and this is the entire point of the wall, so to say, that they will all be saved, all be retransfigured, with some some actually would perish in the fire, others in fact would not survive, would not even arrive there, but at least some elements that had been of it that had been successful can partake, of course, the broader, can blossom themselves in other ways, again in such metaphysical forms that we are not even properly described by other texts, but we can search for in other, like for other videos. So there is this Chinese adage that comes from the Lishi 153 that says, the rites do not descend to the common people. This is also for the traditional doctrine of the castes. In the Lishi, often transliterated as Lichi or Book of Rites, is one of the 5 classics, the Wujing of ancient Chinese literature. Yet another foundational collection traditionally associated with Confucianism. It is a comprehensive anthology of texts focused on Li, so the rites, the ceremonies, and codes of proper conduct that govern social, familial, and political life in accordance with cosmic harmony and moral order. Compiled during the Han Dynasty, so in the same period we're talking about before, for the Vedas, right, eventually put into writing for mentioned works between 202 BC and 220 AD. I made a video about the Han military just recently. The Lishi is believed to have been edited and organized by Confucian scholars, possibly including Dai Sheng, who is credited with its final form. However, its contents draw from older materials, some dating back to the Zhou dynasty, 1046 256 BC. I made a video about the Zhou military, by the way, or earlier, reflecting centuries of ritual tradition akin to what we've seen in India as well, and that again also in Europe we were coming to, like in those philosophy texts, like if you study Plato or Aristotle, or if you study Roman literature, the Roman sagas, you would say, oh, well, it's just literature, it's philosophy. It's actually much more than that, right? Together with the collection of myths, legends, and so on, it's the same thing. Just we've been modernized and secularized in a fashion that we decided. I mean, somebody imposed on us to believe that this wasn't much of a thing, but it's actually very relevant and pretty much there in that form. Unlike a single authored work, the Ligi is a composite text consisting of 49 chapters or sections that cover a wide range of topics, from detailed descriptions of ceremonial practices such as weddings, funerals, sacrifices, to philosophical reflections on the role of rites in cultivating virtue and maintaining societal stability. It complements other Confucian classics like the Analects we mentioned before, Mencius, by emphasizing the practical and ritualistic dimensions of Confucian thought rather than abstract moral discourse alone, as instead, again, you would have been brought to think. Because that's also with the Oriental bias. Oh my God, this wisdom, it's not our terrible religion, like, the Bible. Unfortunately, these people exist. They are part of the plebeian case. They do not access the rights. So the Ligi underscores the belief that the rite, in fact, serves as a bridge between human behavior and the natural order, so something actually divine, aligning, in fact, individuals with the will of Tian, that is heaven, and so the perennial nature. The 153 passage reflects on the hierarchical nature of ritual access in ancient Chinese society. It asserts that the Yili, formal rites such as those tied to ancestor worship and state ceremonies, were the exclusive domain of the patrician class. Nobles and officials descended from revered ancestors whose te, which was essentially the virtue of spiritual power, granted them a divine connection. The plebeians, by contrast, were limited to su, so customs that informal practices lacking the sacred weight of li. This we will see now how this exclusion essentially underscores the patriciate's supernatural legitimacy, paralleling the Brahmana's ritual privilege in India, or the Roman patricians' control of the Auspicia, right? There is, however, here an important conceptual distinction to make, that is to say, what does it mean to be excluded by the rites? I mean, how were some rites legit and others not? Well, the point in it is fundamentally that there is of course, an approximate separation, because, as we explained, again, the lower element was not useless, right? They were alive, and so they bore themselves some spark of divinity that, however, was considered subnormal by nobility or patrician standards, the freedmen. And here we're talking, again, nobility. But remember that, I don't know, if you look at the West in the Romano-Germanic tradition, it was true also among the Slavs in different degree, but fundamentally, like, especially you see it from the Western Middle Ages, the Romano-Germanic concept of freedom entailed true freedom. I mean, if you are a Roman citizen, you are one who has the duty and the privilege of being a Roman soldier, and thus bearing arms as a legionnaire. Same goes for the Germanic freedmen. These are people that bear arms, and arms are sacred. I made a video about the sacred weaponry. I've researched myself something about it for the later Middle Ages, and I will probably write an article at some point about this. But the point is that the divide existing in society that was, again, shared. Think about how the Romans eventually confer the imperium also to plebeian magistracies that are not, in fact, covered by just shoemakers like in the Subura. These were rich, powerful plebeians. And so people that would enter the establishment as elite eventually. So this signified, of course, the standard that every civilization has in accepting that there is a higher nature that basically one part of the establishment would be able to be up to, hopefully, while another was relegated to sort of inferior practice that, however, did help, because without tectonic bases, it couldn't properly even be, for example, the Roman manipular army. As we know it, the Camillian reform was fundamentally about this, and it does come with the aforementioned imperium bestowed on a plebeian consul, for example. So the distinction is fundamental, but it depends both on the relation between these two. These two parts of society, and the overall value, worth of this society. So that, for example, like you could be a plebeian citizen. So initially, those people who were serfs were elevated to be freemen. This is true also, for example, in the Germanic tradition. Look at the Longobird myth, look how many others, how you're knighted, literally. And this continues in the medieval world as well. So there is all a caste society, a hierarchy that is not just crystallized. It's not just like, the castes in India that are much more crystallized, because that society is actually less thrivingly expansive like these other ones. And that's, in fact, through this comparison of civilizations across history that you can only appreciate how powerful these bonds actually were. And unfortunately, again, we've been so much, as I was just saying, enforced this notion that when you look, again, at, for example, at Romanity, everything is described in ever more socioeconomical sense. It's all about, this unromantic and spiritual dimension, almost some sort of republican or democratic atheism or, form of, of materialistic world, right? It's just mere contractualism, mere equations, as if you could reduce this to just a sum of money, mathematics, etc. It's completely alien to these cultures. These cultures are not, even historically, of course, outside of a traditional view of their respective worlds. So going back to China, for example, this is a country where where religion as such, so all the sacred prerogatives belong to the patricians. It was, so the nobility, right, more than anything else, their exclusive property was religion. This is what really determined that, right? We've seen this across the cultures. Doesn't matter which estate is actually in charge, whether the priests or the warriors, the latter is more likely. That's the prerogative. That's the greater closeness to God, right? In fact, only the patricians had the right to worship, and even, in the broadest sense, to the sacra, by virtue of the te, as we've seen before, of their ancestors. While the plebs without ancestors, or at least with less powerful ones, had no right to it at all, right? We talked again in the videos about the afterlife, how this totems proceeded from. But of course, the totems of the patricians were incredibly more powerful, and they could be the major deities themselves. I mean, think about in Rome, how, the major Roman gentes traced a specific lineage straight from deities like Mars and Venus, hence Julius Caesar, etc. But in general, think about the Ennead, think about, they all descended from God. This is the entire point of it all. It's just like everything descends from Odin. In the Norse tradition, they are the same religion, by the way. They all were basically just the linguistic, ethnic, cultural declensions of the same belief of the same metaphysical understanding. And it was the same identical thing every freaking where. And so the plebeians, of course, had a sort of countercultural element. But just to go back to the Germanic tradition, for example, if you pick at the Nibelungs, right? Most of us know the Nibelungenlied from medieval epos and from how, of course, it had been conceived in previous times, and we know the Wagnerian adaptation, etc. But you know that in Norse mythology, the Nibelungs are actually a dual thing. From one side are this race of heroes that and so basically humans, these are not gods, right? They're already fallen, but they are heroic, so they're more like men, right? They are the noblemen, in fact, the patricians that we identify with the Burgundians and the royal stock and whatever, in Attila's time, etc. But at the same time, the Nibelungs are also the dwarfs in other parts of the tradition that, from the Asian perspective, so the Asgard, etc., are actually nether-worldlers, and so an inferior race that is also responsible for. So they are like the dwarfs that, in the same sort of European anthropologists, that live, for example, like knowing the secrets of the underworld. They are like smiths. They craft these magic swords and all this stuff, and that in fact help the same gods, the same Aesir, to build the Asgard, that, however, in this is polluted, actually, because it's not pure gold, or at least it's being touched, it's being degenerated by the Nibelungs. And so you understand how there are different levels, there are different stages that correspond to different quality in this world, right? In this sense, the relation between the noblemen and the people, the commoners, so to say, is similar, right? It's exactly the same. It stems fundamentally from that, right? And it is a racial principle. It is a genetic principle, because your value as a being is not merely deterministic, like in a sort of zoological materialism, because we explained how you can rise, right? Especially the history of Western civilization is a constant rebooting of, redemption of the masses that acquire greater power throughout their adventures, mostly military ones. But that any victory, in full victory, not in just attempts to claim one, that we talked about holy war in the Indo-European tradition, from Arjuna to the Templars, so I don't need to refer more to that. We'll, if anything, come back on the doctrine of struggle and victory. Nevertheless, excluded the zoological materialism, we obtain of course, the understanding, the notion that the genetic accomplishment of the patrician houses was sort of greater. It had this dominance over the rest of these forces. It produced the leaders, produced those who, through the triumph, through the transfiguration in holy combat, through the imperium and victory, the Holy Ghost did earn those shots in the firmament. The entire gladiatorial moon era, for example, was based on this concept. Very few people know what the gladiatorial games actually were about, but it was basically allowing these slaves to earn a place as freemen in the trail left by, still subordinated to the trail of the pass of this senator that had passed, and that in fact was a patrician or at least a nobleman, part of the establishment that really had incarnated that transcendental tendency and accomplishment, earning a place in the firmament. That's why it was so important, like during war, right, to be of the same spirit, because the Romans essentially stated these gladiatorial games exactly to remember also the plebs, essentially what it meant to be a Roman citizen, which was extraordinary. This could actually also explain why the Romans were the only people that, being chosen by God, and so to rule over the world and being the greatest empire in the history of mankind, organize this massively, also bloody spectacles, regardless of what you're usually being told. But they really didn't really kill each other very much. They did. I made an entire video explaining this to exactly show them what was the greatest meaning of being a Roman, like winning over the second death, and even beyond your own same limit. So it's something extraordinary, as the defeated gladiator had to accept in the moment of the condemnation, the fact that he had been defeated, and by fully embracing that, like paradoxically showing that nobility that in that moment ipso facto saved him in death, right? But achieving an autonomous life as a freeman in the afterlife. So this is incredibly beautiful, important. Not all gladiatorial games. Some massacres were just staged also to kill properly criminals, and others that had nothing to do with properly the Munar logic. So that was just for fun and destroying mostly also these lesser people that had deserved to die. As also this was widely shared and known. If anything, the only outrage that came from those spectacles was connected to the fact of how trivialized that had become from the same commoners. Not because it wasn't good to have this kind of shows, or because people were killed in it. On the contrary, this was to be an extraordinarily austere and incredibly important moment for everybody involved. And that's why people complain that, but at least the senators, unsurprisingly, saying that this was supposed to be a serious thing, and now we let the commoners watching, behaving too much in an unregulated way. So there is a sense, at least, because there is also division here between, say, we've seen that right was crucial, right? And so it was a medium of divinity. The point is which divinity as well, because we just said it, some patricians really identify themselves as the offspring of specific gods from a closer time. Of course, all mankind was understood as having fallen, just like humans and even animals, right? Evolution was actually believed in traditional society, except in reverse as involution, right? It would explain also lots of things paradoxically. But aside from that, the sense is that, of course, if I speak Mars or Venus, for example, I'm not speaking about Jupiter. I mean, they actually descend from Jupiter. They're actually part of that. Also, the Roman tradition, Mars was originally something much more important than sort of this fake idea of polytheism that we have been told that never existed, really. They didn't really see it that way. But it was understood that there were different totems from which you had descended that, in this sense, did represent specific deities, of some of the most famous ones. It's like, I don't know, the heraldry of medieval knights. Every coat of arms was indicative of this original divine transcendental origin that, however, had fallen to that specific degree. A color, a symbol, etc., all essentially displayed specific genetic characteristics that you could, in this corporative moment of, for example, the battle, the collective training, the military cohesion, etc., realign to the one in a collectively transfiguring sense. So as you know, there is a division, also conventional in this sense, between sort of Apollonian, the celestial heavenly deities, and chthonic, telluric, earthly deities that are the Dionysian deities, not only, by the way, that are supposedly representing this separation between the patricians and the plebeians. And you know that, say, the plebeians were more inclined towards, I don't know, lesser deities, mostly connected with the pre-Indo-European religion. Think about Keres, the idea of the great mother of the earth that is eventually gravitated by the god of the rain, of the thunder, of the Indo-European conquerors bring. And of course, there is an important blend between the two, because you never see like an utmost, say, say there is God and an anti-God. That's actually a Gnostic misunderstanding. There is just God in a perennial dimension, and then there is this filtering, these layers where you have impressed these images with, say, oscillating with some kind of life or light coming from the above that we would be and that make us imperfect. But as long as we exist, we're not pure darkness, right? Pure darkness equates to death in tradition. There isn't such thing like an alter God. And in fact, all those that are seen, some of you has asked me then, so evil does not exist, what's the Antichrist about? It's not like that does not exist, but that does contain still some level of, it's as an antagonist, someone who is not fully destructive per se, right? There is paradoxically even in Satan this element of, after all, revelation. Paradoxically, Satan, this is also what the history of exorcism says, like does actually tell true things at a point. It's not never like lying completely, being, no, because this was an actual being itself, like the other demons that fell, right? And so that didn't spring out of anywhere else but God, and that for his own fault, an active malice, so choosing the wrong direction to follow, has this antagonistic sense and wants to undermine everything. But it's not per se, in this sense, pure evil or absolute evil, right? This does not belong properly to I know it sounds strange because the Antichrist, Satan, immediately means something counterposed to God and opposite, and sort of specularly, in fact, opposite in everything, but it's technically not quite the same thing. This doesn't mean you can find, say, Satan is sort of a model to follow. No, it's just like the lesser person that you see in the street doing or saying something extremely stupid, that, however, still stands on two legs and maybe goes to work in the morning, right? So it's not like they're particularly contributing to the well-being of society. We could do without them to a degree, but the better choice is actually to exploit that and to hopefully even improve it along the way. So it's there are many religious traditions that at some point were even lost that we know had this way more definitely heretical stance on, for example, the power of and they're all. The power of the devil, they're all basically Gnostic Manichaean. And in fact, they were wrong because they were attributing to this antagonist a power that he does not have. By definition, it's either illusory, and so therefore working in the mind of somebody else that actively self-sabotages, or it's actually finding small traces of actual wisdom, right? It's like asking, I don't know, just an example was said before, ask Satan, I don't know, how hell is. He's able to actually tell you what hell is, and how it was not. It was a consequence, for example, of his own fall, not much a divine creation. It's not like hell was created by God, if not indirectly in the sense that every power derives from God. But this was indirectly created by the fall, by the smashing into the lowest abyss out of one's own fault, that in this sense fell out of God. This is the same spirit. You would ask why I'm digressing on this, because this is exactly the same spirit that informs these traditional societies. I mean, the lesser people are worshipping smaller, less powerful deities exactly because they are bound to this lower element, and it's not like they're making counterculture to the degree, of course, in relative terms to how successful the Patricians are towards heading towards the firmament. But in their own way, they're sustaining the system. I mean, worshipping Keres, right? For example, it's not just, or I don't know, there you have Diana or you have Venus, etc. Like it's, by the way, they have different ancestry that is, even here, not simply making them does not allow to simply frame them as either merely Chthonic or Apollonian deities, but there is a positive element, say, in the harvest. There is a positive element in femininity. So these are not actually they are counterposed in relative terms, but in absolute terms, they're still doing good, and the purpose is to unite them, is to complement them, right? That's what the fundamentally traditional meaning of these cultures fundamentally is. And for example, you have this famous, so of course every group, every ancestry, every totem is aligned with these gods. If you wonder where our cult also entailing the, I don't know, sepulchres, other than, for example, in incineration, that was also in turn the mimicking of a blazing transfiguration. So not really merely material change, but I mean the idea of of the underworld, the idea of statue or anything that becomes sort of anthropomorphic and celebrates this earthly dimension in a way. It's very common. It's just a part of it, right? It's actually traditional, but it's only one part of the world, and it's mostly revolving around that somatic, chthonic, genetic, totemic dimension of the ancestors, which in fact entails like the inhumation as well into the past, right? And it goes back in time to the origin. But there is, at the same time, you see, we pay respect to that, but at the same time we hope that there is another dimension where we live on and the spirit actually achieves that heavenly dimension. This is exactly the same. I mean, for a person that, I was a kid of the 90s, if you that's the world in which we were brought up, right? Also in cartoons and movies and general feeling, even not coming from particularly religious background, like that was our sense, our vision of how reality worked and how we should aspire to. I don't know how people today really embrace that or how they feel. I've seen personally just a sort of, there's this attempt to rationalize and to just treat in, let's not even think about it, because people exercise too much death. Death before was much more present in everyday's life, also, unfortunately, and, sadly so. But there was a positive element of that in remembering, essentially, what that is the point. So the personal relation with the gods is nothing but a personal relation, not with these abstract beings living in the Perineum, but with God itself, right? These were all societies that considered these forces as in any form of power as hypostasis from decayed from God during the fall, right? And the incarnation of the celestial vault. And as such, they basically devoted to them as themselves in order to recognize, for example, on the basis of a specific inclination of the person. And this fall, so what literally was more similar to you for some reason, more akin to you, the vehicle, like the specific path to the one, right? In fact, this is the same thing with the saints, right? If you had very, if you, for example, my grandparents were somehow devoted to specific saints, right? Also, your name, usually, like in our tradition, we are after different. We give properly a name. My name is Hellenic, for example. My surname is Germanic, and my middle name, my Christian name, is Jewish. So there, you want to feel that this is a sort of these are sort of souls that you express in a way that you were given. I, for example, have. Yes, I have technically just two names for the Catholic Church, in addition to my surname. But the let's say you are meant to be just an expression of this. It's just the same astrology. The idea that these celestial bodies are actually the same manifestation of these divine beings, It doesn't mean that you're basically influenced when you're born, but the moment in which you're born was meant to be that because you reflect. Like it's a double-threaded connection, that specific arrangement of the universe that is you in some ways. And so this is how they actually believed. And so devoting yourself, like as I was saying, well, especially my maternal grandmother, for example, was particularly devoted to Saint Margaret. In fact, one of my cousins is Margaret is after that. And this, I don't know the story, by the way, behind that. I should ask my mother about that. But evidently, like, this was a very important deal. The fact that there would be a very strong devotion towards that particular saint or another has, sure, I would not say which saints I am, let's say, also through my name, because I would have to reveal my name. I'm sort of more evidently devoted to. But indeed, like there are different paths there you can feel, just like the different souls, the different names, the different ethnicities. I just recently took a DNA test, by the way, to look at my ancestry. It was very interesting. And in general, these are all things that you can perceive historically speaking if you are aware, of course, of what the roots of the world fundamentally are. And, well, you can see this traditionally as these are my roots because in those roots lays God, right? In those roots, from those roots I came out. And if I go back to those, I will essentially reconnect also with much of the rest of the world. Like, I don't single that out from the world. On the contrary, the more back in time I go, and the more, the closer I am to God. This is literally what they believe. But still, in a political and societal function, they believe that, including through the rights, etc. For example, the plebeians had their own rights, right? And so they administrated them with the same seriousness, maybe less than the patricians by themselves, because these deities sometimes were much more, I don't know, vulgar. Literally, think about, I don't know, phallophories and similar things like that. Mirrored sort of the lesser people's thrill, but this is exactly what we were looking at here, right? And the reason why they did that is that there was in fact a collective function to it. Like, if those forces had not been active, the entire system would have actually jammed. That's why also these religions were actually so complicated. Actually, from the Roman one, we get an enormous amount of this because the Romans were truly more successful than other peoples because they had installed themselves in some of the, if you want, more Pelasgian elements. If we talk about the Mediterranean in general, and Pelasgian as a broader anthropological context, but also from some of the stronger Indo-European stocks, right? And the outcomes could be different. If anything, the great Roman merit was to be able to reboot the fully Apollonian Indo-European sense of dominance that sort of started later. For example, the Dorians, who were the most successful Indo-European, the most successful European conquerors, the Europeans, founded Delphi, the Omphalos of the world, and you have from there, however, a partial sclerotization. Some of the earliest, they came mostly directly from the Black Sea, whereas the Italics, for example, were more coming from the Baltic, and there is a great debate there as far as which branch, because there were also some Illyrians came from the Balkans in southern Italy, etc. But the Romans, as Latins, Latino-Faliscans, some even attempted this distinction, saying Latino-Faliscans came from northern Europe, and the Osco-Sabellic groups were from instead the Balkans, very many Balkan European. But that's just vague. There are sure consonances between Roman and Norse poetry, as everybody knows. But the point I was making, hope not forgetting this, is of course the Greeks, for example, inherited this greater inflexibility, this greatest genius, greatest confidence, if you want, even in the concept of themselves. You see in the greatest accomplishment of Hellenic civilization, of philosophy, and the Byzantine civilization, etc., but it also maintains this sort of more crystallized, stratified sense. So this is a bit like India with the castes, right? Whereas other groups are more dynamic, like the Italics, the Germans, the Celts themselves. There are more waves. They're struggling more, but they keep alive also that light, and are in the mix of the Romans able to be not just warriors that accomplish just out of the times of desperations coming from the fringe of the system, but they actually reflect and will, right? That's true providence and vision, that order to be affirmed. In fact, there is a beautiful and famous declaration that aligns with this principle, that is involving the ancestors, by Appius Claudius, that is Auspicia sunt patrum, right? This term is incredibly important. Auspicia, as you know, were the auspices, so truly what was vehiculated. If you read, for example, the Res Gestae of Augustus, it's divination, you would say, but it's truly probably what you get from the vehiculated the medium, the ritual medium with God, right? So this is again incredibly important. It comes from Auspex, that was the same name of the augur, the priest, plus Hume, and the etymology in turn of Auspex was avispex, so he who examines the birds, right? Observe, and these auspicia were intended, of course, like at this point in Latin in a more figurate sense. But birds are, of course, the ones closer to God, including the eagle, for example. And of course, we think mostly about the Ruspicina of the more chthonic element within Italy. There were the Etruscans that were, they were not, we don't even know that what they were. Yes, they're a big mystery, but at large were still rulers that had to do at some point there with Indo-European ancestry, and just being differently calibrated has just made the case now compared to the more warlike Italics, for example, in surrounding them. In any case, we will talk about them probably soon, because they have something coming on the ancient Tyrrhenian naval warfare in some sense. And Appius Claudius is also just so crucial, defining what was described for the plebeians. So the fact that they lacked rights. In fact, he says, non avigentem, non habent. Consequently, in Rome, the patricians viewed the plebeians' way of life and partnerships as scarcely different from that of even of beasts, more ferarum, right? Thus, the supernatural remained the cornerstone of the traditional patriciate identity, just as it did for legitimate kingship. It was a sacred tradition beyond just a lineage of blood, of racial selection that shaped the ancient aristocrat, right? After all, even an animal can exhibit biological vital purity or maintain untainted blood, but it's still carrying the genes of an animal. So this was again true also for the plebeians, and it's different for the inequality compared to the patricians. Just before concluding, because I wanted actually to complete this video earlier, but we're going to take this far. The name Appius Claudius refers to, actually wanted to make longer, but we have just so much time, and I was glad I could digress on some interesting topics. The name Appius Claudius is really incredibly famous in the history of ancient Rome. He himself belonged to the prominent patrician gens Claudia, that was notoriously one of the most noble in the urbs. There was more than one Appius Claudius, by the way, and here we're talking about the Caicus, not Sabinus in Lenses, for example. But both of them connect to themes of Roman tradition and supernatural legitimacy, of course, because, again, the gens is in common, and so you must understand the totemic basis for that. Nevertheless, Appius Claudius Caicus, we'll have to talk about him more in depth. We mentioned him in the video about Pyrrhus, obviously enough, because you know how, why, but we'll repeat it now. But he was really a towering figure in the Roman Republic, known for his roles as censor, consul, so all of course, offices provided with imperium, so he would know better about the Auspicia. He was a statesman who bridged traditional patrician privilege with innovative reforms, showing that capacity of expansion and not of crystallization of the imperium. Born into the illustrious Claudian family, he first rose to prominence as censor in 312 BC. Just think these were the years in which the Livian legion, so-called, like the first fully developed manipular legion, had for sure, like historically, come to being. Appius Claudius held the position of censor for an unprecedented 5 years, in fact, contrary to the usual 18-month term. Also showing in this sense how the cycle could be broken, because all these terms were religiously calibrated. But this guy was so great at it that he could afford to step further. And this happens often, like for these important figures that really augment themselves in Roman, even in the otherwise, in fact, very orderly Roman system. This cemented, of course, Appius Claudius' influence, to say the least. His most enduring legacies are the Via Appia, the Appian Road, Rome's first major road linking the city to the south, and the Aqua Appia, its first aqueduct, both named, in fact, after him, reflecting his audacity and practical impact. These projects began during his censorship, were strategic moves to bolster Rome's military and urban infrastructure during the Samnite War. Caecus' connection to the supernatural and traditional authority aligns with our discussion of patrician privilege. The Claudi claimed descent from Sabine origins. This is quite interesting. I recently made a video about the Italic peoples in general outlook, and the patrician status of the Claudi was tied to sacred rites, because the Sabines represented that priesthood within the system. The Romans, the warriors, the Sabines. That's where the phrase Auspicia sunt patrum stems from, because of his specific ancestry. You see how precise what we said about the genetic background and the proper sense of the Auspicia, of divination, in this case stemming from the Claudian awareness of Sabine ancestry and the original sort of meaning that this had in the history of Rome as the more priestly dimension as opposed to the Latin warriors. Remember that there was the principle of femininity that you see in the lunar aspect of sometimes of the older Roman calendar, but it had been stratified from, again, this mix of Apollonian and Chthonic elements, but that was very much proper of the Sabines initially. That obviously lose to the Romans, right, to the Latins in general, but coming also pretty close to Rome itself. And I discussed this in the video about on the Roman superiority of Roman civilization, the moral superiority of Roman civilization and Indo-European interpretation, the role of the Sabines properly in that mechanism. And so this was asserting specifically the exclusive right to interpret divine signs, this cornerstone of Roman religion and governance among these people that had literally founded Rome, had really molded Rome in what it was in at this point, also especially in this explosion of conquest and unscathable moral rigidity, but also like strength, power more than else. This, by the way, echoes what we've seen before in Ligi's exclusion of plebeians from rites of the Brahmanas ritual monopoly in India. Like Appius Claudius' family's prestige rested on such sacred traditions, not just lineage, right? So they had to be capable, otherwise they would have simply degenerated, and distinguished them from the plebs, who were seen as lacking divine ancestors, the divi parentes, right? Literally, there were those, again, ancestors that had made it into the firmament and that were considered, in fact, divi. You see it even with Caesar, the deification process. beyond infrastructure, by the way, Caecus was a cultural pioneer. He is credited as one of Rome's earliest known prose and verse authors. He's also very innovative. And connected with this priestly background with works that include like juristic treatise, for example, De Usurpationibus, that is now lost, but that tackles some of the fundamental aspects of legitimacy of power, rule. Like, so you understand that this is not merely a Roman legalistic technicality, as we've been past. This is deeply connected with the religious traditional background. Moral sayings, of course, because the sagas of the Romans are actually a big deal, and Latin is such extraordinary language, producing with Appius Claudius famous phrases such as "faber est suae quisque fortunae," which is incredibly important from a military and religious point of view, because fortuna, mater et filia deorum, was considered in later times by the birth of Christ by everybody as basically being unpursuable, right? The fortuna basically is an equation to the providence now become detached from human will. This is also what dictates the law. At this point, instead, what does Appius Claudius says? That the fortuna is made by yourself, that your own victory is by controlling the fortuna, and so being a god yourself. I made an entire video about this. It was incredibly crucial in Roman theology. It's the Fortuna Caesaris that literally has to do with the foundations of the Republic. So again, from Appius Claudius, that boasted such priestly background and necessity to write down these principles, you see all the boldest Indo-European sense of leadership and manly affirmation into literally molding the world in your own image. Appius Claudius' censorship also saw controversial reforms. He redistributed landless citizens across voting tribes for stiffening the army. He admitted sons of freedmen to the Senate because of the aforementioned redeeming capacity, and published legal procedures, the legis actiones, essentially opening access to law and ritual calendars. These were the years, again, in which the Roman army was being fully molded into what we know in that plebeian gaining voting rights and the one to bear arms so that Rome could expand to the degree we have. So Appius Claudius supervises and acts on this. And this, of course, moved that irked the conservative nobility, but reflected a shift towards a broader inclusion, albeit still under patrician oversight, and in Rome it could never be otherwise. So later in life, blind, hence Caecus, so means the blind, and elderly, he delivered a legendary speech in 280 BC that we know well against peace with Pyrrhus of Epirus. By the way, who does want peace, right? Those who want dishonor. Think about when people had attributes, not the lesser people that we witness in the world today that want peace. At least, without a fight, it's ridiculous. The level of it's a level of racial inferiority. Let's be honest. That's what it stands for. The generation of mankind. Appius Claudius famously rallied the Senate to reject terms that would have weakened Rome's hold on southern Italy against the Hellenistic ruler, and carried into the chamber his eloquence, preserved as the first recorded Latin oration, swayed Rome to persist, shaping its trajectory towards dominance. Right, and this act mirrors, by the way, the traditional leader's role as a moral and spiritual anchor akin to the Zongyong's ideal of a sage attuned to cosmic forces. So you understand that everything comes back. Cunes, that was sent by Pyrrhus to Rome, visiting the Senate to test the waters regarding this new people that were apparently barbarians from a Hellenic perspective, but not so barbarians, evidently. And that's the notion of it, said that this was not an assembly of men. It was council of gods, because the senators themselves incarnated that model by their own, as we've seen in societal, traditional religious expectations. These were the Romans. So something that really tells you by scale how superior they were, and why they emerged as world rulers, unavoidably driven by God. It's all in the sap of our purest European identity. And without that, nobody can achieve any power whatsoever. So remember what it means to have power, to rule over other peoples, to be a true leader, and not the disgrace that people think that humans should be today. It's mostly what they deserve, but also something that we don't need, right? Very well, I was glad today to talk some amount of length about this stuff. Actually, turns out we're going to make even more videos about this this whole stuff, and I'm glad that we can again talk more about these topics in depth. But for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.